Good morning, everyone. It is a great honor to introduce this morning's presenter. From Germany, Dr. Frank Uekotter is a reader at the School of History and Cultures at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. While teaching at Munich's Ludwig Maximilian University in 2006, he assisted in the creation of the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental and Society, an institution devoted to take an interdisciplinary approach in the environmental humanities and the social sciences. With over 20 publications, as either articles or books, Dr. Uekotter has been widely published in both German and English, with emphasis on Germany's environmental history, comparative environmental history between the United States and Germany, and the tenuous relationship between agricultural practices and the environment. More recently, Dr. Uekotter has shifted his research gaze to a more global approach, with a current project that examines environmental history within the context of globalism. His future research will take aim at the global mentality of monoculture agriculture and the consequences such agrarian practices have on the environment. Dr. Uekotter?
All right. Well, thanks, David, for this very kind introduction, and thanks for everything okay here? Thanks for inviting me to this really special conference. Elisa told me a year ago this would be an unusual event, but it really is. I mean, including the music that we had the pleasure of listening to this morning. The one regret I have that is if you listen to their music, you just realize the imperfection of the human voice. But that's all I have here. So I was thinking about, should you sing here now? But no, I'll spare that. There's something else I would like to thank you for, and that is for giving some room to the humanities at this conference on the living soil. Now, you heard in the introduction that David gave that I teach environmental humanities at the University of Birmingham in England. And when I say that I teach environmental humanities, there are usually two questions that I get. First, what is environmental humanities? And second, what is it good for? And I'm not offended by either of these questions. Academic disciplines should be good for something, and it is not immediately clear that you need the humanities if you want to solve environmental problems. We've heard a lot about soils yesterday, about the interplay of chemical, biological, and physical processes that make up the living soil, about the fragility and the resilience, and we hear more about this today. And I think we already understand that you need scientists to understand all these things, and probably scientists that are particularly brave, because what I understand is that soils are, as scientific objects go, a particularly intricate object of study. But where do the humanities fit in here? Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, I do not understand the biology of the living soil any better than my esteemed co-presenters, but the living soil is not just a phenomenon of nature. It is a product of human interventions. Our approach to the land is framed by things that are eminently human: land titles, markets for agricultural commodities, government policies, research at universities and other institutions. We know a lot about the living soil, much more than previous generations, but knowledge is not something abstract, a disembodied entity that is just there. It needs communication, and it needs context. And of course, the word context is the word that you use often if you are a trained historian. So when we talk about the living soil, we really talk about societies too. But societies are not an abstract, unified whole. In fact, a German sociologist, Niklas Luhmann, once argued that it was pointless to talk about society as such. In Luhmann's word, society does not have an address. What he meant to say is that we should focus on groups and their respective worldviews, not a mythical view of society as such. And I think soils are a good case in point. Most people do not engage with soils as Americans or Minnesotans, or on a personal note, Germans, but as farmers or scientists or advisors or policymakers or as consumers of food. We should look at these views in their own right, and we should see how they come together and whether they come together at all. As you will see, there is a lot of bad communication when it comes to soils, mutual misunderstandings, and just plain disinterest in what other people say and think. And when it comes to communication and analyzing communication, maybe the humanities can show some skills that we can use to become better stewards of the soil. let me add one more dimension here by way of introduction. When we talk about the problems of the living soil, we do not just talk about problems that we just covered just yesterday. And that is how it goes with many problems in our interaction with the natural world. When we talk about environmental problems nowadays, we always talk about challenges that we have known for decades. Pollution, climate change, extinction of species. We're dealing with all these things for quite a while, at times for generations, and it is worth reflecting on these past efforts. Now, many people are reluctant to talk about history when it comes to environmental problems. Would it do any good to look back at the failings of the past? Shouldn't we look ahead and work towards solving environmental problems? I suggest a different perspective. I think we can and should see our past engagements with environmental problems as a treasure trove of experiences. We have learned something about the living soil, and we learned something as we dealt with the living soil and its problems. We set up institutions, government programs. We developed a cultural imagination of what soil erosion is and how it looks, and these things frame our approach to problems today. So when we talk about the living soil, we're not just guided by scientific findings, important as they may be, but we're also guided by organizations, by technologies, by cultural traditions. We're guided by a legacy that we have acquired and that shapes what we see as a problem and what we do not see as a problem. And as you will see, some of the debates that we are having at this conference look a bit different when you take the stock of this legacy. When we talk about government programs about soil erosion in the United States, we talk first and foremost about a federal agency that's been mentioned many times already at this conference, the Soil Conservation Service, renamed Natural Resources Conservation Service in 1994. It exists to this day. You probably have seen their display here outside the conference doors. If you have not, please do check it out. Now, the Soil Conservation Service made a rather dramatic debut on the stage of history because it grew into a large bureaucracy within a matter of years. At the start of 1933, the number of federal employees who worked on soil erosion stood at exactly 0 in the middle of 1937. 4.5 years later, the number stood at 13,331. Check that number. So this is the quick growth, and it is a pattern that we see more often in American history. And if I may say so, as somebody who is not a US citizen, this is a pattern that really shows America at its best, in its ability to launch campaigns against environmental challenges almost out of nothing. Now, many countries have abused the soil in the past, but few have managed to turn around on a dime and start a crusade in the opposite direction with all the resources that America could muster: scientific expertise, government policies, and a spirit and a determination that few nations of the world can bring to environmental causes. And the sudden rise of the US Soil Conservation Service fits this pattern perfectly. This new agency, as it grew so quickly, mirrored a grim determination that soil conservation was no serious business. Of course, this shift did not occur in a vacuum. It was the years of the New Deal, where the Soil Conservation Service was one of numerous new agencies that were created from scratch. And as you well know, in the 1930s, the federal government commanded greater resources than ever before in a grand quest to overcome the Great Depression. And of course, the words New Deal agency is not always a synonym for efficiency. So let me add here that the Soil Conservation Service was certainly one of the more successful ones. The agency's success had much to do with an energetic founding director, Hugh Hammond Bennett, who led the agency for almost 2 decades until his retirement in 1952. You see him here on the cover of a biography that celebrates Big Hugh, the father of soil conservation. When I look at that, I'm always reminded of the saying among historians, don't judge a book by the cover. Well, I guess you can make an exception for this one here. So if you like critical biographies, this is not the book for you. It's still rewarding to look at Bennett more closely. Well, I guess I don't have to explain to a US audience that founding fathers matter, and that is true for the founding father of soil conservation as well. Bennett was an acclaimed expert who wrote a number of important books on soil conservation, one of which I took actually to this conference. That was my night reading in the last couple of days. But Bennett's real talent was about selling soil conservation, or shall we say, preach soil conservation. Historian Arthur Schlesinger wrote, that Bennett spoke about soil conservation with Old Testament wrath, and he was not the only expert of the time who spoke about soil conservation as if it were a religious duty. The second man in the soil conservation service, Walter Lowdermilk, even went to Jerusalem and proclaimed an 11th commandment, which read in parts, "You shall inherit the holy earth as a faithful steward." Of course, it's tempting then to quibble about the 11th commandment in theological terms. If you've done your Bible reading, you know that the original 10 commandments were not written by humans, let alone by federal officials. And you learn that Moses received them from a higher authority. And that transaction did not take place in Jerusalem, where Lowdermilk was speaking, but on Mount Sinai, which is some 300 miles to the south. But if we leave theology aside here for a moment, I think it is worth noting that a US government official was speaking about soil conservation in the Middle East as early as 1939. US soil conservation was a global story, a global affair, almost from the beginning. American experts went abroad to advise governments and farmers and preach the gospel of soil conservation, and the global campaign against soil erosion would look very different without that advocacy. And within those countries was Germany, where Marshall Plan aid went into soil conservation efforts as well. Of course, Americans did not just do this because they're nice people, and a lot of the soil conservation work was framed by the Cold War. But times being as they are, maybe we historians should speak more about this global outreach of US soil conservation, and not just because one of the countries that benefited from US soil expertise was Iraq. Now, the 11th commandment is also a good mirror of the rhetoric that US soil officials embrace in their fight against erosion. It came with a sense of moral urgency. Saving the soil was about nothing less than about saving civilization. Even in the depth of the Great Depression, Hugh Bennett and others were not shy to proclaim that soil erosion was the most serious problem that the country was facing, and this rhetoric was crucial for the making of the Soil Conservation Service. It gave the young agency a sense of mission, a spirit that helped to overcome the challenges of the early years. It was no small feat to build a new federal agency from scratch, to set up the research institutions, networks with county agents and farmers and so forth. And, not to be forgotten, soil conservation expertise was perhaps the only type of expertise that was in short supply in the Depression years. Much of these early years were about learning on the job, and this SCS had its share of blunders, but really, who wanted to talk about these things when it was all about something greater, about saving civilization by saving the soil? That's a powerful mission statement if ever there was one. But the rhetoric of soil and civilization was a more ambiguous asset beyond the walls of the Soil Conservation Service, and it's not difficult to understand why that was the case. This was the Depression years, after all, when everyone had all sorts of problems, and then there were these soil conservation folks who argued that the problem number one was about the soil. Who were they to define priorities when everyone was struggling? And even when times were better, maybe it was a bit narrow-minded to state that soils mattered more than anything else. Maybe it was even fundamentalistic, in that to a determined soil conservationist, nothing else seemed to matter. There was a fine line between preaching soil conservation in the style of Bennett and Lowdermilk and disdain towards the rest of society. And this was a particular problem when it came to the farming community. Many of you will know that the Great Depression was not just about Wall Street, it was also about a deep crisis of agriculture. Commodity prices collapsed. Many farmers struggled to keep the farm, and many farmers lost that struggle and had to leave. So how do you sell soil conservation to a farmer who tried to find a way to pay the next installment? Well, you certainly did not get anywhere with a desperate farmer when he talked about soils and civilization. And I mention this here because the gap between soil conservationists and the farmers was not just a phenomenon of the New Deal years. The narrative about soils and civilization is an evergreen of erosion warnings to this day, pun intended, and you heard an echo of it yesterday, particularly in Dave Montgomery's presentation. And just to be clear, it is a narrative that has substance. Feeding the world is an ongoing challenge, and it becomes an even greater challenge if we push our soils into oblivion. My concern is not with the gravity of soil troubles, but with the worldview that a fundamentalist approach produces. Fundamentalism fosters closed worldviews that stifle communication, and soil fundamentalism is not an exception. It creates a rift between the soil conservationists and the farmers that is hard to bridge. It creates a division between the experts for the soil and those who work the soil. It allows soil conservationists the long view, while the farmer struggles with the ongoing crop cycle and the vagaries of commodity markets. In short, we end up with a situation where one side has the moral high ground and the other side has the land. Now, how did the Soil Conservation Service deal with this clash of perspectives in the 1930s? Well, the leaders of the SCS thought about comprehensive land use planning in the early years, and that includes Bennett and some others, about tools to instruct and command the farmers to do the right thing. But these ideas remained exactly that. Dreams about land use planning never turned into a policy blueprint, let alone a reality. Instead, soil conservation came to work through incentives, payments in return for soil-conserving crops, or use of machinery that farmers could buy by themselves, or subsidies for lime and drainage work. I won't go into the details here. Of course, a lot depends on the specifics in the different regions of the US. But the big story is that the new dealers made a deal with the farmer. We provide you with help, and you, the farmer, do a bit more to conserve the soil. And with that, soil conservation followed the classic approach of the Extension Service. We go to the farmer and help the farmer help himself. And that meant that everyday soil conservation work was very different from the grandiose rhetoric that Bennett and others embraced in their Sunday speeches. One official compared the reality of soil conservation work out in the fields to selling insurance. This was not exactly the kind of crusade that the narrative of soil and civilization demanded, but it brought some results, and it is tempting to speculate how work in this style would have turned out in the long run, with overproduction, a strong state, and a growing body of soil expertise, all these things of the 1930s. Maybe this could have produced a sustainable, soil-conscious agriculture in the long run. But times were changing, and you all know how they were changing. The United States entered the Second World War, where maximum production was key for victory, and then came the post-war years. And the post-war years brought a transformation of agriculture unlike anything that the world had ever seen. I must confess that it was this transformation that originally brought me to deal with agriculture as a historian. And the longer I'm studying this transformation, the more it amazes me. Within a single generation, everything changed on the farm. New machines, new chemicals, new markets, sometimes even new crops. And all this happened not just in America, but all around the globe. The net result was an explosion of yields per acre, a growth of the global food supply that has no precedent in human history, and a race among farmers to adjust. Many of you will know the famous advice that US Secretary of Agriculture Earl Betts gave to America's farmers: get bigger, get better, or get out. And I guess quite a few of you will know what this meant on the ground. A fateful choice for farm families who could either leave the farm or try to stay abreast in a brutal competition. When it comes to the living soil, I think there are several things that are important about this transformation. First, we live in a new world of agriculture, for better or worse. Machines, chemicals, scientific expertise play a greater role than ever before, and there is no way back for the foreseeable future. Second, the intensity of soil use grew tremendously. Nutrients and chemicals cycled through the soil faster and in greater quantities than ever before. Machines were heavier, and plows were bigger and more intrusive than ever before. And, just to be clear, nobody could know how this would play out. And a lot of people said that exactly at the time. The transformation of agriculture was a giant gamble, a step into the unknown, and in a way we still do not know how this gamble will play out. And third, soil conservation was part of this transformation, or maybe I should say it was caught in this transformation. As organized in the New Deal years, soil conservationists were locked in an alliance with the farmers. And if these farmers moved towards more intensive use of the soils, conservationists had no choice but to go with the trend. And if we look at soil conservation work in the 50s and 60s after Bennett's retirement, it's sometimes hard to say what this was really about. Was it about better, more productive soils, or about healthier soils, more sustainable soils? There was something else that was changing in the post-war years. Farmers were working in an increasingly urbanized society. Fewer and fewer people lived in rural areas, and fewer people had a farming background. And that mattered tremendously for those who sought to save the soil. They were working in a society where fewer and fewer people really cared about soils. This includes even the environmental movement that grew into a new political force in the 60s and 70s. The lion's share of environmentalists came from urban areas, and they cared more about pollution and garbage and other urban problems than about soils. In fact, many environmentalists came to see the farmer as the enemy. They were using pesticides and chemicals, they were causing pollution problems in rivers and groundwater, and the industrialized meat production in ways that raised concerns about animal welfare. And against this background, environmentalists were reluctant to take soil trouble seriously. Their view was, if the farmer, in addition to all these sins that he commits anyway, mistreats his own soils, isn't that ultimately his own problem and not an environmental problem? Or maybe it was even a deserved fate? That is how it looked from the environmental community. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious, I'm painting with a pretty broad brush here. The environmental movement was never a unified movement. It was growing out of numerous struggles and numerous issues. And some of these inputs came from rural areas, and specifically the alternative farming community. But even here, it's rewarding to take a closer look. Most people who buy organic food nowadays do so because they think it is healthier, tastier, has less chemicals, and that organic farmers treat animals well. Few people think about soils when they buy organic food, though they would have every reason to do so. The historic origins of organic farming lie in concerns about the soil. I'm lacking time to elaborate here, but it's amazing to see how the quest for healthy soils triggered experiments around the globe in the first half of the 20th century, with Albert Howard in India, Yves Balfour in England, Rudolf Steiner in Germany, or Louis Bromfield and Malabar Farm in this country. Much of this legacy is forgotten outside certain circles, but sometimes names record the roots of organic farming. In my home country, Great Britain, the largest organic farming organization is named Soil Association to this day. And against this backdrop, it should come as no surprise that the Soil Conservation Service developed an ambiguous relationship towards the environmental movement. Some of its work even drew direct criticism. The Soil Conservation Service had supported drainage projects that threatened wetlands, and those wetlands were often close to the heart of environmentalists. So by and large, the upswing of environmentalism did not support soil conservation to the extent that one might think. It merely produced triangular communication between environmentalists, agricultural experts, and farmers. And the cause of soil conservation has been adrift within this triangle ever since. Well, I hope you see that it is rewarding to look at soil communication through a humanities lens. It is easy to argue in principle that we should conserve the living soil, but in reality there is no we out there, but rather this mix of farmers, advisors, researchers, and environmentalists who all had their own views of interests. Everyone agrees on a general level that we should save the living soil, but this general agreement did not translate into a powerful alliance. And the history of soil conservation is a history of misunderstandings, of alliances that might have been and never were, and of icons that never were. That even holds true for that one soil erosion event that everyone knows, the Dust Bowl. If you go to the NRCS table in the exhibit, you'll see that Dust Bowl pictures are right there on the table. And these dust storms of the 1930s have long turned into a transnational myth. I learned about it when I was in high school. And this serves as kind of a visual indictment of the failure of human stewardship regarding the soil. But again, it's rewarding to take a closer look. Now, the Dust Bowl was real. It was disrupting lives, both the lives of those who stayed and lived through it in the southern plains and those who moved to California. It also offered dramatic visuals. The view of an approaching wall of sand was terrifying, and it made for spectacular pictures. You see one on the screen behind me. But in a modern culture, which is to such a great extent a visual culture, it is crucial to remind ourselves that pictures don't say it all, and they don't speak for themselves. The Dust Bowl was open to different readings, and they weren't always about the soil. It's important to recognize that when the Dust Bowl was happening in the 1930s, most people who heard about the Dust Bowl had never been to the southern plains, which was the region that was worst hit by the dust storms. This was the last region in the continental US that experienced settlement, and the US government had called the southern plains the last frontier of agriculture as recently as 1923. So just 10 years before the first dust storms, this was still a declared frontier region. The myth of the Dust Bowl developed in the absence of first-hand experience, and that allowed a range of readings. Now, Bennett and the Soil Conservation Service obviously tried their best to turn the Dust Bowl into an icon for the perils of soil erosion. That's the things you take to Congress and talk about. But for others, it was just a general symbol for the misery of the Depression years. Everything that America stood for seemed to erode in the Great Depression, and now even the soil was eroding, that quintessential symbol for stability and permanence. And even those Americans who did care for those who lived in this disaster region did not always do so out of pure sympathy. In the traumatic Depression years, the Dust Bowl was also a way to move personal grievances into perspective. Historian David Danbaum has argued that, and I quote, "People beset by depression needed someone white with whom they could identify and who was worse off than they were." That was how it went in the 1930s. And I'm not sure whether this has really changed all that much in subsequent decades. The most recent bestseller on the Dust Bowl, Timothy Egan's book, The Worst Hard Time of 2006, talks about soil conservation, but soil doesn't come up in the title. And much of the narrative focuses on stories of human survival, the quintessential American story of endurance in the face of hardship with just a bit of salt to add. So this is really much more a book about the American character than about the soil. And the Dust Bowl remains a template for different concerns to this day. And it is also about the cultural occupation of a peripheral region. If Americans had been truly soil conscious in the 1930s, the southern plains were an odd place to look. There was another region where soil troubles had a much longer history and where far more people were living, and that was the American South. Erosion in the American South was different from erosion in the Dust Bowl region. It was more about water erosion than wind erosion for once, but it also had dramatic pictures like these one. Let me just show you these pictures here of gully erosion from Stewart County in Georgia. This is Providence Canyon, an entirely man-made canyon, which is less than 200 years old. Now, if you look at these pictures, this looks like this is rock. This is actually sand, and it's still eroding to this day. One single thunderstorm erases all the scribbling that tourists are doing on these walls. A self-cleaning mechanism of another nature that was, custom, as it was custom built for the age of tourism. This is also, has quite a measure of fame among geologists. Also has a nickname. The Little Grand Canyon is the word that is often used for it. Kind of a bit of an understatement. The Grand Canyon is a mile deep. This is 250 feet. But it's certainly a place that teaches you something about the power of erosion. Think all this earth eroding within less than 2 centuries. That teaches a lesson. And it's a lesson actually that is being taught here as Gustavus too. I learned that one geologist actually does a field trip that leads to exactly this canyon. Now, Hugh Bennett and the Soil Conservation Service certainly thought this was a good icon of what erosion really is. And they used pictures to make that point. In the soil conservation literature, Providence Canyon was the poster child of southern soil abuse. But did it actually work? It is interesting to see that the people of Stewart County tried their best to evade responsibility. The history of Providence Canyon is a long string of attempts to downplay or ignore that humans created these gullies. Even when Providence Canyon was turned into a state park in 1969, the rationale focused on the beauty of the place and specifically the dramatic colors. And when you check information about the state park on the website of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources today, all that you learn is that the gullies were, and I quote, caused simply by poor farming practices during the 1800s. Well, we can be more specific about the causes of soil erosion here in the Little Grand Canyon and elsewhere in the American South. It was about monoculture. Few things are more detrimental to the health of the soil than excessive emphasis on a single crop, something that David Montgomery pointed out yesterday. And the American South is just one of many regions in the world that were showing the scars of monoculture. The American South, as we know it, was a product of cotton, and we can see the imprint of the empire of cotton in trade networks, labor regimes, and racial hierarchies. So, when we speak about monoculture, we do not just talk about plants. We're talking about commodity chains that typically focus on one and only one commodity. We're talking about commodity hubs, about systems of credit, patterns of land ownership, labor regimes, all of which serve monoculture. We're talking about research institutes that often focused on improvements for that one and only crop. We're talking about technology. Many machines were custom built for that one crop, and then economics depend on economies of scale. You only use them productively if you really use that technology a lot. And the more land you have, the more you can use the technology. And my very important point, we're talking about mindsets too. We're talking about a state of mind, an intellectual hegemony that made it difficult to even think about alternative crops. Legions of agricultural advisors tried to convince the farmers of the American South that there were actually quite a few alternatives to cotton, but most of them did not get very far. And diversification is usually a tough sell in monocultures, not because they're impossible in biological terms, but because people struggle to even think about them. If we understand monoculture in this broader sense, we begin to understand why agricultural systems all over the world have shown a remarkable cross-cultural tendency to focus on one single crop. It was not that anybody thought that monoculture was good farming practice. There is no biological theory of monoculture to this day. And there is plenty of evidence that diversity is actually a really good idea for the soil and in other respects of Wales. The quest for monoculture did not come from the fields. It came from commodity chains, technologies, and research networks, and from the mindsets that they produced. Soils rarely reward monoculture, and they often punish those who practice it nonetheless. But with this huge infrastructure, material and otherwise, pushing for that one and only crop, abandoning monoculture was usually easier said than done. And depleted and eroded soils were just the price to be paid here. And the gullies of Providence Canyon are just one of the more glaring cases in point. Now, if we view monoculture as a state of mind that is about far more than crop rotations, we also realize that the next monoculture may not be about crops in the first place. It's curious to see that when humans approach agricultural issues, they seem to have an innate tendency to prioritize one and only one dimension and try to subordinate everything under that overarching goal. And if you look at this tradition, you get mixed feelings about the upswing of interest in soils among climate scientists. I'm particularly concerned in light of that mantra that we hear so often from the climate community, that in the long run, global climate change is the most important environmental issue, for these are the hierarchies that rarely play out well when it comes to the living soil. I was glad when I listened to the presentations by Claire Chenu and Ratan Lal yesterday. I was glad to hear they did not say this, that climate change is top and everything else is secondary. Quite the contrary, they made clear in their presentations that carbon sequestration only makes sense if you look at it in a wider context. So awareness is there, but awareness is only half of the story here. What about institutional momentum and the financial resources that climate change mitigation might hold in the future? With poorly designed policies, carbon sequestration could become the next monoculture, and I fear that the most vulnerable regions will be those in the most marginal places. Now, let me be clear, climate change is real, it is made by humans, and as it stands, our efforts against global climate change lag far behind planetary need. And yet, I find the idea that climate change matters more than anything else deeply problematic. It is another one of those fundamentalisms that seem to run through the history of soils, and I don't find it any more convincing than the other soil fundamentalisms that I've touched upon. If soils can teach us anything, it is that there is more than one perspective that matters. should be fertile and allow productive farming, both in the short run and in the long run. They should resist water and wind erosion. They should hold water, and yes, they should capture carbon on a warming planet. But we should be under no illusion that all these things point into the same direction. We need soils that are productive and resilient, moist and carbon-rich, and these soils need some kind of balance. And soils need people who understand that balance is something that we can never just have. Balance is something that we have to work for time and again. And the moment where you think you have achieved balance may be exactly the moment where you're about to lose it. Balance is the one key word for soil stewardship in the 21st century, and the other is context. There is no place for monomania in our world, and certainly not when it comes to soils. And if the history of soil conservation teaches us anything, it is that a narrow focus, be it on conserving or exploiting the soil, is simply bad business. What we need is an approach to soil conservation that builds alliances, maybe to the climate change community, or maybe to a farming community that knows that monoculture is not just a problem about the healthy soils. Monoculture also notorious for other biological troubles, for plant diseases, for pests, for weed problems, and so on. The farm in the audience will know this very well. And monocultures create fateful dependencies. We have plenty of stories about monocultures that ran into trouble when the price of the key commodity crashed. The history of soil conservation teaches us to seek alliances with other causes, and maybe we can build a new alliance around the problems of monoculture, or, to put it in a positive term, the promise of diversity. So, soils in the balance are more easily sought than achieved. We need a lot of scientific expertise. They need well-trained farmers who recognize trouble in the soil. And they need policies that reward farmers who look ahead. Subsidies will be part of this regime, and the only question is how they work and whether they play out. But I think soils in the balance needs something else. It needs a culture of self-observation. Please note, what I did repeatedly in this talk was step back and look at concerns in a wider context. What were the interests at play? What were intended effects? What were unintended side effects? Where did people really interact and engage with other people's views? And where did people just talk past each other? I think we need to step back more and watch ourselves as we engage with other parties. And maybe the environmental humanities, my sales pitch here, can be of help in making that crucial step back. If we talk about communication, about preconceptions, about the allure of visuals, we're talking about things that the humanities have talked about for ages. Few people ever set out to become fundamentalists when the talk comes to soils, and yet quite a few became fundamentalists because they never made that crucial step back. Ladies and gentlemen, let me add one final thought. What I've sketched here is not a solution in the strict sense, a way to get healthy, resilient soils. It is a path in that direction, a way to work in this direction. And I think that's far more than a play with words. In the 1930s, people like Hugh Bennett could promise to save the soil once and for all if only people would give enough resource and attention to their own soil conservation crusade. But 80 years later, we know that healthy soils are not something we can achieve once and for all. It is something that we need to manage day for day, month for month, year after year. And managing environmental problems is something different from just administering environmental problems. It's not about kicking the can down the road. It is about good paths and bad paths, about paths that offer a balance of concerns and paths that privilege one concern over all others and practice monoculture of the mind. And it is about the requirement of all these paths: knowledge, technology, coalition of stakeholders. I think when we talk about the future of healthy soils, we should think more in terms of good paths and bad paths. And if we ever have a problem doing so, I think this has more to do with the weight of history, with our imagination of environmental problems and how it was shaped by past experiences. Our environmental imagination tends to think about problems of the natural environment in terms of solutions, as you see in so many speeches about solving environmental problems and numerous books that have problem solving in the title? Well, solving environmental problems was a good idea in the 70s and 80s, when there were still a lot of problems around that you could actually solve by banning things like leaded gasoline and other things. But if you look across the range of challenges that we were wrestling with in our time, I think we're done with the problems that we can literally solve. I don't see an ultimate solution for any of the environmental challenges of our time. Climate change, biological diversity, extinction of species, depleting resources, or yes, soil troubles. We will not get rid of these problems for the foreseeable future, but we can engage with them and should engage with them. We should manage problems, pursue paths that bring us closer to environmental sustainability. So as we engage with the soil, as we learn to manage the healthy soil, and as we learn to accept management as a rewarding concept, we are learning about far more than soils agriculture. We learn what it means to engage with environmental challenges in a 21st century world. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Professor Uekotter. There will be a question appearing on the screen shortly for an audience poll, and then we will switch to opening the question